Welcome back to the Olive Grove podcast, where we like to take these really cool deep dives into the Bible and find things that you might not have noticed before. Today we're going to be jumping into the book of Zechariah. He was a prophet who had some very strange visions, but they're really powerful. So today we're focusing specifically on chapter 5. And in chapter 5 we have these two crazy visions. One is a giant flying scroll, and then the other one is this woman who is trapped inside of a basket.
Yeah, these visions that Zechariah has are very vivid, probably some of the most vivid visions in the entire Old Testament.
For sure.
And it's interesting because they're not just meant to be a spectacle. They really do have profound lessons in them about judgment and about God's desire for his people, and then the consequences of what happens when you stray away from his path.
Yeah, for sure. So let's unpack this first vision, the flying scroll. Zechariah sees this giant scroll, and it says it's 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. And I was thinking about that, and that's the size of Solomon's temple porch.
Wow. Yeah, it is.
It's huge.
That's crazy.
And it's covered in writing, and it says it's the 10 Commandments.
You know, it's fascinating that the scroll is so big. It really emphasizes, I think, the grand scale of God's law. It's all encompassing. It's kind of like God is saying, my word is everywhere. It's inescapable. And it's this standard by which everyone is going to be judged.
That's a pretty intense picture, and it's not just floating around. It says that this scroll goes into houses and consumes them.
Yeah.
It even devours timbers and stones. It's like the law itself is bringing judgment.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the scroll, it goes into the homes and then it consumes them. It really points to the consequences of being disobedient, of turning away from God's commandments. But I think it also hints at the limitations of relying solely on the law in order to get salvation. You know, it's interesting because the scroll represents the law, but it's the law that is bringing destruction. And in a way, it's foreshadowing this New Testament message of grace that we find through Jesus.
That's interesting, this tension between law and grace. The law shows us our need for a savior.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You know, while the law shows us our sin and shows us God's standard of holiness, it's really through Jesus that we find forgiveness and restoration. It's kind of a beautiful paradox.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of paradoxes, let's move on to the second vision, which is the basket. Zechariah sees a measuring basket called an ephah pass by, and inside the basket is a woman.
Oh. Okay, Zechariah, you're really testing my interpretation skills here.
Right.
What is going on?
So an ephah was typically used for commerce.
Mm-hmm.
It was used to measure grain and other commodities.
Okay.
So right away, I think we see a connection between this vision and the material world, trade, economic activity.
I was wondering if the basket could represent something positive, like abundance or God's provision, but then somehow it gets twisted and distorted through human greed. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really insightful observation. You know, the basket itself doesn't seem inherently evil.
Right.
But it becomes the symbol of wickedness when it's used for selfish gain, when people are just trying to accumulate wealth at the expense of other people. Okay, that makes sense. And what about the woman inside the basket? What's she doing in there? What does that represent?
Yeah, the woman in the basket is particularly intriguing. You know, some scholars, they interpret her as just representing wickedness in general or idolatry, like wickedness or idolatry is being contained by the basket. But she could also symbolize something more specific, like adultery, like turning away from God for something else that promises fulfillment but ultimately leads to emptiness.
So it's like the vision is saying the love of money, this draw, this pull towards material wealth, can lead us away from God just as easily as any other form of idolatry.
Precisely. And notice where the basket is taken to Shinar, the ancient land of Babylon.
Oh, Babylon. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere.
Right.
Because that's a name that has a lot of meaning behind it. It's not just some random ancient city. It represents human pride, empire, and opposition to God. Like, think about the Tower of Babel story in Genesis, where humanity is trying to reach heaven on their own without God. Babylon has that same spirit of rebellion.
Exactly. And there's one more detail that adds another layer to this. Babylon is actually being rebuilt today as a tourist destination. It's almost as if this vision is coming to life in a way we might not have expected.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm really curious to explore how the rebuilding of Babylon as a tourist destination might reflect some of the things we've been talking about, like materialism and the desire for worldly success.
Yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. And speaking of thinking about these deeper questions, I want to remind you about a wonderful resource, My Christian Space. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Zechariah and you're looking for a community to kind of explore your faith further, we really encourage you to join. It's an online community where you can connect with other people, you can share your thoughts, and you can learn from each other.
Absolutely. And you'll find a really welcoming and supportive community there. And, speaking of supporting communities, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the work that's being done by Enduring Freedom Ministries. Their mission is to support and help communities in need, especially in Jerusalem.
They're currently working on a project that's very close to our hearts here at the Olive Grove podcast. They're establishing a food pantry in Jerusalem to provide essential nourishment to those who are struggling.
And it's such a good example of putting faith into action, addressing the needs of those who are struggling, and really offering a tangible expression of God's love. And if you're moved by this mission, we encourage you to go to their website and consider making a donation. Any amount, doesn't matter how small, can make a real difference in people's lives who are facing hardship.
Now let's get back to Zechariah chapter 5. We were just discussing the basket being taken to Babylon.
Right. It's like a prophecy being fulfilled in a way that we might not have even thought about.
What's fascinating is this connection between the woman in the basket, who represents adultery and turning away from God, and Babylon, where commercialism started.
So it's like the vision is saying that loving money, that pull towards material wealth, it can lead us away from God, just like any other form of idolatry.
Exactly. And if we look at this vision as part of the whole message of Zechariah, we see that there's this recurring theme of God calling his people back to himself, back to faithfulness and obedience.
And these visions, they're like warnings about what happens if you stray from that path. But they're not meant to be purely negative or scary, are they?
No, absolutely not. Remember, Zechariah was talking to people who had just come back from exile in Babylon. They were rebuilding their lives, their temple, their nation. These visions were like a call to action, a reminder to stay focused on God amidst all the challenges of rebuilding and the temptations of the world.
That's a message that we can all relate to, even today. We have our own challenges and our own temptations that can lead us away from God's path. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to be successful and wealthy and comfortable that we forget what really matters.
This brings up a really important question for all of us who are listening. What are the baskets in our lives? What are the things that might be fighting for our attention and our loyalty and pulling us away from God?
That is a powerful question. And I think it's one that we all need to spend some time thinking about. These visions in Zechariah chapter 5, they offer a really powerful way to look at our own hearts and our motivations.
They remind us that true fulfillment doesn't come from material things or worldly pursuits. It comes from having our right relationship with God.
And they challenge us to think about the sacrifices we might need to make, the idols we might need to let go of, so that we can embrace that relationship fully.
It strikes me that these visions also highlight how relevant the Ten Commandments still are today. Even though we're not under the law in the same way that the Israelites were, the principles in those commandments, they still matter.
Absolutely. They give us a framework for how to live a life that honors God and respects other people.
And even though we don't have a giant flying scroll coming into our homes, the consequences of disobedience, they're still real.
They might look different for us today. It might be broken relationships or guilt or feeling of emptiness, but the pain is still real.
The beautiful thing about the New Testament message is that we don't have to deal with these challenges by ourselves. We have the grace of God through Jesus Christ to give us strength, to forgive us, and to guide us back to the right path.
And that's a really encouraging reminder. It's like those two visions, the scroll and the basket, they work together to show us the whole picture of God's heart. There's judgment for sin, yes, but there's also this incredible depth of love and mercy. God doesn't want to punish us. He wants to restore our relationship with him.
Exactly. And that restoration is possible because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. He took the punishment that we deserved so that we could be reconciled to God. It's because of his grace that we can overcome the power of sin and live in a way that pleases him.
So what does all of this mean for us today? I think it's a call to look at our own hearts, to figure out what those baskets are that might be holding us back, and to commit ourselves to following God's path, knowing that his grace is enough for us.
And it's a reminder that real fulfillment isn't about what we have. It's about who we become. People who reflect God's love and righteousness in the world.
As we've been talking about these visions, I keep thinking about that project by Enduring Freedom Ministries to build a food pantry in Jerusalem.
Yes. It's such a great example of putting faith into action.
Meeting people's needs, showing them compassion, and giving them a little taste of what God's kingdom is like right here on earth. It's so inspiring to see them making a difference in the lives of people who are struggling. And it reminds us that even though there's a lot of darkness and brokenness in the world, there are also people and organizations that are working to bring light and hope.
Absolutely. And if you're moved by their work, we encourage you to visit their website and think about supporting them. Even a small donation can make a big difference.
And if you're looking for a community where you can really dive into these topics and connect with other people who are on a similar faith journey, we encourage you to check out My Christian Space.
It's a great online platform for sharing your thoughts, asking questions, and supporting each other. It's a really welcoming and supportive community.
Before we finish up for today, I want to go back to those thought-provoking questions we asked earlier about the baskets in our own lives.
Yeah, those are definitely questions worth thinking about as we continue our own journeys of faith. What are the things that might be competing for our loyalty, pulling us away from God? Are we willing to be honest with ourselves and make the changes we need to make so that God is truly at the center of our lives?
Those are tough questions, but they're so important if we want to live lives that are aligned with God's purpose for us.
And remember, we don't have to figure it all out on our own. We have the Bible to guide us, we have our faith communities to support us, and we have God's grace to help us every step of the way.
That's a great reminder. And if you want to keep learning and discovering more, make sure you subscribe to the Olive Grove podcast on YouTube. We have lots of other deep dives like this one.
And you can also get early access to episodes and join our amazing online community by visiting the My Christian Space website. You'll find links in the show notes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Zechariah chapter 5. It's been great exploring these powerful visions with you. Until next time, may you be blessed with wisdom, discernment, and the courage to follow God's path.